Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us in this virtual book discussion of Kemi Balogun's book, Beauty Diplomacy, Embodying an Emerging Nation. So this book is the first from the Stanford University press series that I co-edit with Hung Kam Tai, Globalization of Everyday Life, which features ethnographies of cross-border connections. So in addition to the author, Kemi Balogun, we are joined by three leading and award-winning gender studies scholars, as well as sociologists, including Zine Magubane, Ashley Mears, and Eileen Otis. So each one of them will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. But before they do so, and they'll speak alphabetically, but before they do so, we will begin with Professor Balogun speaking briefly about her book.
Thank you. And I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you to Dr. Rhacel Parreñas for moderating and for having part of this really exciting book series. And I'm really honored to be a part of it. Thank you to all the panelists. And thank you to those behind the scenes at Stanford University Press who have done the work of organizing and handling all the logistics of this virtual book event. So I first want to start off giving a bit of a background about how I got interested in this topic, and then kind of briefly overview the main arguments that I make in the book. So really there were two kind of pathways which got me interested in looking at the Nigerian beauty pageant industry. And one was that first during trips to Nigeria, I noticed that pageants were really part of the social landscape of urban life in the cities I was in Nigeria. And so I noticed that they were covered regularly in the newspaper. They were televised on different networks. There were a few times where I would be out just in a shopping mall and I would see a pamphlet of a beauty pageant. And at one point, my younger sister was even recruited to be a part of a pageant in Nigeria. So I was interested in the ways in which these contests, beauty pageants, were becoming kind of common or kind of ubiquitous. And I was interested in what they could tell us about the intersections of gender, nation building, and globalization. And so thinking about that as a specific case for thinking about broader issues that I was concerned with. Another kind of pathway that I got that made me interested in looking at pageants in Nigeria is a particular event that happened in 2002, which I have a whole chapter of my book devoted to the time in which Nigeria, the International Miss World pageant in 2002. And it was ultimately moved out of the country to London because of sets of protests that happened both within the country and also outside of the country. So internationally, it was, there were boycotts and concerns about hosting the event in Nigeria because time where a woman by the name of Amina Lawal was sentenced to death for having an extramarital affair and having a child out of wedlock. And so because of that ruling and a lot of concerns about human rights abuses, especially for women, some participants and some delegates, beauty contestants in particular from around the world, didn't want to participate in the contest. And so those issues became kind of wrapped up into the pageant as well, because again, this was happening during that same time period. There were also concerns within the country in terms of not wanting to host international pageant there, primarily due to religious concerns that people were bringing up. And so I became interested in the ways in which the different kind of complex protests that were happening both domestically and internationally brought in larger political concerns around the recent codification of Sharia law during that time period, the recent return to democracy in Nigeria, issues about regional conflicts, and really using that event as a way of thinking through those broader political concerns, and thinking about how think how that international pageant came to stand in for these broader issues and ways that directly reference women's bodies. So again, thinking about these, this is an example of theoretical concerns around gender, nation building, and globalization. So aside from that particular case, which I have a whole chapter of the book devoted to, the rest of the book incorporates ethnographic fieldwork and archival materials, look at 4 pageants in total. And I use these cases to incorporate the perspectives of multiple stakeholders, from the owners who hold the license for the pageants and own the pageants, to contestants, to fans and critics. And so I'm interested in both those who champion beauty contests in Nigeria and also those who criticize them, in order to understand these complex relationships between gender, nation building, and globalization. The other argument that I make in the book is around this concept of what I call beauty diplomacy. So beauty diplomacy is a strategy used by pageant affiliates as a way of rectifying Nigeria's image. So globally, as well as domestically, there are a lot of discussions about needing to kind of prop up a lot of the negative images around Nigeria's reputation due to these conceptions around Nigeria being mired in conflict, in chaos, in corruption. And many of the beauty pageant affiliates that I interviewed and interacted with saw themselves as best equipped to engaging in forms of image management that would turn around the poor image of Nigeria, because they were media savvy, because they had business acumen, because they were used to presenting kind of the best versions of themselves to the world. They felt that they were in a position to present more positive attributes of Nigeria as a nation and re-articulate a more positive vision of the nation through their work. So for example, female beauty contestants would engage in various forms of charity work that championed the most vulnerable segments of Nigeria. And by presenting themselves as polished, as accomplished, and as hospitable young women who were, had many dreams and aspirations and who were upwardly mobile, they built an image of themselves as not only charitable, but also championing the goodwill of Nigeria as a country in terms of being cultural ambassadors. On the other hand, pageant owners, who were mostly men in the Nigerian beauty pageant industry, viewed themselves as building like a better business environment in Nigeria by providing jobs, by facilitating business deals, and promoting trust and reliability. This investment in beauty diplomacy, however, was not without constraints. Not all of those who have, not everyone is able to access the industry due to issues of age restrictions, body and beauty standards, and access to material resources. So I'm interested not only in how beauty diplomacy as a narrative gets deployed and managed and promoted, but also what is the limits and constraints of that narrative. So I'll end there and kind of look forward to the book discussion from the other panelists.
So thank you very much, Kemi. And so now we're going to go to our share their thoughts on the book, about the book. So I hope we have a lively discussion. We're going to start with Professor Zine Magubane.
Okay, delight to be asked to comment on this book. It was a terrific read, and one I've looked forward to since I think I read an article that preceded it in Gen Society a couple of years ago. And I just need to take a moment to say it's the most beautiful book cover that I've seen in a very, very long time. It just makes you want to buy the book and read the book. What I guess I wanted to zero in on was this concept of aesthetic capital that you deploy in the book, which I found a really fascinating and useful one. As a bit of maybe framing my comments, I'm from South Africa, which also has a fairly robust tradition of beauty pageants. And in fact, this year, I think it was this year has passed in such an odd way. It could have been 5 years ago, but I believe it's just this year. A South African woman won Miss World, which set off a really, really interesting discussion within South Africa, particularly around the issue of aesthetic capital and what image of a woman is considered beautiful in South Africa. And the woman in question who won was distinctive because she had a very short afro, no weave, brown-skinned woman. And some women, I will unabashedly say myself, thought it was absolutely terrific. I actually found myself stumbled onto the pageant. I'm not a pageant watcher, and then found myself like cheering like crazy, and also questioning my feminist bona fides, as I was like, what am I actually doing? So I can attest to the fact that it does bring forward a lot of feelings, like almost like cheering for a sports team, which I've never done, never been interested in. But that feeling, go, you're representing us, this, instant feeling of we-ness and belonging, which I'm really pretty skeptical of. So in any case, in the South African context, it was very interesting that within the African community, there was a very strong reaction to whether or not she was actually beautiful. In particular, her hair became a lightning rod because South Africa is a place where many, many people get weaves or idealize a much more Eurocentric standard of beauty. What is an interesting contrast with Nigeria is that South Africa, being a white settler colony and having a significant number of, Euro-Africans, for lack of a better word, has always strongly had an aesthetic that is very similar to what you might find in the pages of an American beauty magazine: blonde hair, blue eyes, extremely skinny, or trending towards very, very light-skinned African women, right? So I wondered that, I would love to hear some of your comments further about the fact that Nigeria, not being a settler colony, even though there were, you did talk about different contestations, in particular over like weight, body size, hair. You talked about being styled and also having a weave, I think, placed on by the stylist. So I wondered if you would talk about some of those issues of beauty aesthetics and how the global and its framing, because you also talk beautifully about how influence and interact, but very much also how the local impinges on that or pushes back on that. And so I thought it would be an interesting contest, or I'd love to hear a little bit more about how some of those beauty aesthetics that played out. I also thought that the whole notion of aesthetic capital was really interesting. Do you think that it operates similarly to other kinds of capital? For example, like one of the things that people most prize about capital is that it can be passed on to others. And in some senses, this kind of capital, it's, being able to be retained or passed on to others is different, right? So I wondered if like the notion of aesthetic capital or beauty capital, if you could talk a little bit more about both what it opens up for possibilities of thinking about, thinking about the different forms that capital takes, but maybe some of the limitations, because it is a bit different than other kinds of capital, given that you can't even really bequeath it. You might be beautiful yourself, but you can't bequeath your beauty on to other people. And of course, the hoarding of capital, the investing in capital. I mean, this is an interesting sort of investment about maybe plastic surgery, which you also had an interesting discussion of. So just playing around with that idea, it would be fantastic to hear a little bit more about. And I think another thing that I found interesting that I would love to hear more about is how, which was gestured to in the text, but I'd love to hear more, is how Nigerian feminists, interact with, talk about, feel invested or not invested in these pageants. Like, how do they play into, discussions of feminism in Nigeria. Oh, promised, it's typical academic fashion, promised this was my last point, but there's just one more. And then finally, the issue of ownership. It seemed that men seem to still dominate in the productive sphere, the owning of the pageants, right? The ability to actually realize profit in the ownership of the enterprise. And I wondered if perhaps, like, for example, any contestants ever became owners or have started their own pageants. Like if you can parallel to American celebrities, right? Like someone like Rihanna, you know, she moves out from being a pop star to owning, you know, Savage Fenty and, you know, becoming a business owner herself. The woman from America's Next Top Model, I'm blanking, which is crazy. America's Next Top Model. Tyra Banks, of course. So Tyra Banks is able to take her beauty, right, and leverage it into an entire, you know, brand and television show that gives her an ownership stake in a completely different type of capital. You know, Heidi Klum does the same thing. So I wondered if any of the contestants in that kind of direction, and if you could, you know, again, love to hear in the comments anything around, you know, that type of beauty diplomacy and extending, or even perhaps becoming diplomats themselves, reality TV television star as a president, having a background in entertainment is no longer a barrier to political ascendancy. So I wondered if there were any trends towards that. So thank you, fantastic read, so fun, and I completely plan to assign it in African World Perspectives next year.
So thank you so much for those comments. I hope people in the audience are excited to buy and read the book if you haven't already. So our next speaker will be Professor Ashley Mears.
Great, thank you. So I will repeat some of the comments from Zine, but on aesthetic capital and on ownership, but in a slightly different way. But let me start first saying congratulations, Kemi. It's a really great book, a really good read. This is a very good sociology of beauty told through the beauty pageants in Nigeria. And so as I was reading it, I was remembering this moment about 5 years ago. I had an exchange with a colleague who mansplained beauty to me, first by asking me, what is beauty? And then by like barreling forward his account, which is that beauty is power. And the evidence for this was like how he had seen the power that a beautiful woman could command just in like walking down the street and like harnessing people's attention. All right, beauty is power. It's such a platitude and so asociological in its formulation. But in this book, Kemi takes that idea and situates and kind of unravels beauty as a form of capital in the way she shows that it enriches the actors who are able to embody the look, the total package, as well as the corporations, the brands, and even the state. And so beauty paves a way forward for upward mobility for women, but crucially, I think also for the men that are connected to them, who position themselves close to the beauty queens in order to advance their businesses. Collectively, everybody's advancing the economic and the cultural position of the Nigerian state. So this pageant is really powerful in the way that you portray it in the book. So a couple of things that stood out as really interesting is like how the beauty queens understand themselves as representations of ordinary people that use their celebrity status to forge ties in order to do humanitarian work and charity work on behalf of Nigerian people. And that's the pursuit of the real beauty queen, right? Which is different from the more like the model, who's just the pretty face, who's in it for the fame and the fortune and shirks those responsibilities. Yeah, so there's like kind of interesting tension between like the model and the beauty queen. And the pursuit of the real beauty queen and also the model is pretty expensive. So about this idea of aesthetic capital, like the gowns, the manicures, even the $33 entry form for a new contestant, the accent lessons, the grooming lessons, like you kind of trace all the ways this business of beauty is like comes with a very big investment. So a question that leads always about capital is like, what is its convertibility? It seems pretty clear that for the owners, for the promoters, the corporate sponsors, all of the men that are in the industry, that they're able to capitalize, forge ties, build their businesses, right? It's true, we have a reality TV president, but also a former beauty pageant owner president as well, right? Not to forget. So you have this nice like Marxist political economy critique built into the book, where you're kind of showing the profits are spilling out beyond the queens themselves. So then the question is like, well, what is the conversion rate for women? In the short term, they get perks, they get some money, they get a lot of gifts, they get amazing social connections. And then in the long term, there's a question mark. So it's been about 10 years since you started the fieldwork, and you follow up, you say, with the women, and they're doing really interesting things. Like some of them have NGOs or nonprofits. Some of them use it as a springboard to go into their own entrepreneurial ventures in real estate or in entertainment. They have these impressive careers. But there's a lot of pageants in Nigeria. And there's a lot of, I want to know, what's your sense of, is this a vibe for how many, and for under what kinds of conditions? Does it vary by the contest? Does it, you know, what do you see as being some of the outcomes and the possibilities of this pathway of upward mobility that the women talk about there, but we would have to follow up with them systematically to know? All right, another question is also about return on investment, but for the state. So I was really struck with the opening of the fact that Magubane, she wins Miss World as a Nigerian woman in 2001. And the pundits are claiming, like, you know, what millions of dollars in advertising and PR campaigns couldn't do for Nigeria, this 18-year-old girl has done it, right? Like brought goodwill to the Nigerian state. Like beauty is power. But I did wonder, like, what's the relative worth of the pageant? Because it's one of many different kinds of cultural industries that the state can invest in: football, sports, fashion, arts, museums. And so the way that you write the book is that the beauty pageant is so central in doing this work of diplomacy. But I did wonder, what's the value of it vis-a-vis other forms of civic and cultural diplomacy and the music festivals and so on. And then the final question, this is the final one. It's the question of personal sponsorships. And I save it to the last because it's like this thing in the book that's kind of taboo. And I wanted to get your take on it. So the personal sponsorships are when older men with money help contestants, right? Somebody calls them the uncles, that like the older men who are kind of bankrolled the women's participation. In exchange, they get some kind of mutually beneficial relationship, like transactional sex. It's the undercurrent, you know, but people are kind of saying it, but they're not saying it. And that's kind of running through the book. It seems like some men are known, some very rich men are known to date only beauty queens, and beauty queens are like a status symbol that they can swap out, much like an expensive sports car. By the way, in modeling, actually in Sex and the City, a man who dates exclusively models is called a modelizer. So there's, and I'm sure that there, like lots of different spheres, you know, involving display of beautiful women has these different terms for it. And of course, there's inequality here in the way that respectability plays out, because a woman who has personal sponsorship has to hide it. She raises eyebrows, whereas a man who's dating only beauty queens gets the bragging rights of that. No surprise, there's a double standard. But what is surprising is the extent to which it seemed that the contestants believe that the crown is actually handpicked through an off-the-books bidding war among the political and economic elites who are trying to give favor to their sponsored women. So my question to you, Kemi, is if you were to center transactional sex in this world, like how would you go about studying it, and how can we trace the significance of the uncles and of these kinds of relations in a world like this where nobody wants to talk about it outright? And that's my final question. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ashley. So our final speaker before we open it up for questions. So I invite the audience to start writing your questions if you have any in the chat or in the Q&A down there. Professor Eileen Otis is our next speaker.
Thank you. And I'm really honored to be part of this group and to have the opportunity to comment on this amazing, just really beautifully written book. It's quite a riveting read. And I have a bit of self-disclosure here. When I was about 10 years old, I was in a beauty pageant. I lost, I came in last. I cried on the stage. But I have to say, this was like, for me, this was a moment where I really realized how class plays out. Because my mom made me this kind of scrappy dress that looked beautiful on the pattern, but compared to the expensive dresses that the other girls wore, it was, it just looked like, a 10-cent Halloween costume we got at Walmart. And the other girls had piano lessons. And it really became clear to me how class played into this. And it also, today, it, of course, makes me reflect on how these institutions shape girls' aspirations and what they can do. And so the question of convertibility, and I realize that this plays out very differently in places like Nigeria and China, which is my field of expertise. So the question of convertibility is absolutely crucial. I have some written comments now because I really, the theoretical analysis was so spot on and really nuanced and beautiful. I wanted to incorporate some of Kemi's own words. So let me begin to read some of these comments. Again, this launches a series. This is something Rhacel mentioned, Globalization, Everyday Life. Kemi's book makes this really innovative contribution by examining the intersection of gender, nationalism, and political economy. While in the US and Europe, beauty pageants are often considered a nostalgic and perhaps retrograde spectacle from the past, in emerging economies of the global South, beauty pageants are extremely popular and often lucrative. And this is true in China, again, my field of expertise, where beauty pageants have totally proliferated. Yet few scholars have sought to understand their broad appeal, and Kemi makes a pivotal theoretical and evidentiary contribution to our understanding of their role in the culture and political economy of emerging nations in an increasingly multipolar world. One really just impressive strength of this book is the way that Kemi links the beauty pageant industry to large of global political economy. So Kemi draws on rich ethnographic observations from multiple pageant-related sites, including front stages, back stages, offices, and contestant training sessions, as well as interview data collected over a span of 9 or 10 years. She gained extraordinary access to the beauty pageant industry, participants, coordinators, multiple stakeholders, yielding a richly textured picture of the pageant industry and its relationship to national identity. In Nigeria, we learn beauty pageants are numerous, diverse in format, and have wide popular appeal. By the end of her field work, Kemi was told by an informant there are now 3,000 pageants in Nigeria. So marshaling her substantial cache of data, Kemi deftly shows how class-inflected female beauty staged for national audiences does the important symbolic work of building a shared sense of nationhood, while at the same time promoting a growing consumer culture that reflects modernization of the country. It also aids Nigeria, now the largest economy in Africa, in repairing its national reputation globally, while challenging a long-standing racialized hierarchy of beauty informed by colonial legacies. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I don't have COVID. So Kemi rejects easily dichotomized categorization of pageants as oppressive or liberating for women, instead showing the ways that pageants construct a social reality for participants, as well as the nation. This social reality argument, Kemi creates an embodied nationalism. This is one of my favorite concepts from the book. Embodied, that can heal conflict and resolve reputational dilemmas. Nigeria gained independence from Britain in and the decolonization process left the country with borders encompassing a wide range of religions and ethnicities, with bisection between the Islamic North and Christian South. Pageants bring the hope of mending ethno-religious divides through projection of shared feminine ideals, even though they at times tear at the fabric of the nation. So young women's bodies are recruited to help solve this important reputational and identity problem for Nigeria and other emerging economies, the problem of credibility, corruption, as well as civil and ethnic tension that have accompanied a post-colonial struggle to build a cohesive nation. This is a lot of heavy lifting for young women. They do so in myriad ways, bringing together elites and average citizens, projecting ideals of Nigerian nationhood globally and locally. In the author's words, the pageants, quote, craft a common vernacular of the nation, one that is both defended and disputed by their audiences, unquote. So this solution is far from perfect, with regions practicing Sharia law, protesting the display of women's bodies, not to mention debates that the pageants elicit about authenticity, ethnic authenticity. So what struck me especially was how vividly the book showed the ways in which pageants stage ethnic group diversity, especially the Queen Nigeria pageant, allowing viewers who live in a country of 250 distinctive ethnic groups to envision an ideal of depoliticized harmony through the bodies and practices of young women from different Nigerian states. Of course, this elicits conversations about cultural authenticity and ethnic representation. In this practice, to quote Kemi, quote, states are falsely presumed to be ethnically homogeneous and are reduced to certain identifiable cultural markers without adequate acknowledgement of the complex underlying identities that make up these boundaries, unquote. Here, Kemi's analysis is nuanced and astute. To create unity in difference requires that difference itself be limited and represented in delimited ways. Meanwhile, that the same diverse group of women were being prepared for the pageant by coaches who altered their deportment so that they would all walk like models on a runway, thus eliminating evidence of diverse bodily habitus. The beauty embodied by pageant contestants is widely viewed as part of a dynamic, hopeful process of reshaping global cultural aesthetics, offering an important point of national pride that, along with music and fashion, direct the global cosmopolitan away from the West, distributing it instead across multiple poles, including Nigeria with its already quite successful culture industries. To conclude with a quote by Kemi, paying close attention to emerging nations is critical to understanding the next phase of globalization, as a range of nations seek to dominate the international political economy and cultural marketplace. Middle stage countries such as Nigeria seek to shift the global center toward their own nations by helping to create a new world order that challenges yet recognizes Westernization and hybridity of cultures. End of quote. So really, congratulations, Kemi. Really beautiful book. And I guess, I do have one question about especially about the ways in which the pageants create sort of political frames for the ways in which the contestants view their futures and views their potential participation in politics. So you do look at in the book the ways in which women engage in different kinds of NGO activity and civic activities. There are always, sort of opportunities for the contestants to answer certain, questions, often about politics, in the pageants. And I wonder, has anyone brought a kind of heterodox politics to that mission, or do they tend to stick with middle class frames that are already sort of recognized as credible and legitimate in Nigeria? So thank you for inviting me, and look forward to our discussion.
Okay, so thank you very much for your comments. So Kemi, would you like to first respond to the many questions that have been posed so far, and then we can switch to, we can open it up to the audience for questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Zine, Ashley, and Eileen for your very generative comments and questions. So I'm going to kind of try as best as I can to tackle them. So the first questions were around beauty aesthetics and kind of clarifying some of the global and local tensions. So on the one hand, I found that there was definitely a critique of understanding the ways in which, for example, having really long hair weaves, or there were some contestants that were encouraged to lighten their skin, though it was not regimented itself, but through working with coaches, for example, they might be encouraged, if you have dark patches of your skin, lighten them, etc., to have a more even skin tone. And there was definitely an acknowledgement by some of the people I interacted with that, this is a way of encouraging Eurocentric standards in terms of body size, in terms of hair, in terms of skin. There's also a critique that many of the contestants are lighter skin, and those tend to win. However, I also found that it wasn't as kind of clear cut as that. So oftentimes people would tell me we're not trying to look white, or it's not about trying to emulate Eurocentric beauty standards, but having things like hair weaves shows that you have a lot of money, because these often are very, very costly. And so they would often frame it in terms of class. It's a way of looking, it's a way of looking more polished, looking more that you have access to money and wealth. And so we can definitely kind of critique that further to see what are some other underlying issues being race and colorism, for example, that might be embedded in those statements, but they often were resistant to fully thinking about it as completely emulating Eurocentric standards. One of the pageants I studied, the Queen Nigeria one, included a lot of kind of symbolism and narratives around wanting to pivot and not frame beauty standards as being Eurocentric. And instead of using like terminology, like a Eurocentric terminology, they would frame it as international. And so they would say these are international standards, not necessarily Eurocentric. And there's a possibility of shifting them and pivoting them to recognize African beauty as being important. So for example, the first Queen Nigeria, kind of her, one of the reasons that people would explain that she won is that she had natural hair, she had very long, thick natural hair. And the Queen Nigeria pageant would talk about, this is an example of us valuing our own beauty and recognizing it as important. I think also important of kind of that local international tensions is that many of the folks that I interacted with also saw kind of Nigeria as being a really important hub for kind of aesthetic culture in terms of its fashion industry, in terms of other culture industries that it's known for, Nollywood, and kind of presenting particular media imagery, and thinking about that as kind of centering Nigeria as really being an important global hub. And so it wasn't just in terms of recognizing that there are these international standards that have been commonly dominated by Western European countries or Eurocentric countries in the global north, but being open to the possibility of shifting those aesthetics through the imagery that was in the pageants was also like a possibility. So it wasn't completely kind of cut and dry. It was a little more complex. And I talk about, there's one chapter where I think I talk about it more about that complexity. But I think it's important to kind of think through some of those nuances. Then there are also questions around aesthetic capital. So thinking about what are the ways in which people were able to kind of trade on aesthetic capital, convert it, pass it on to others? What are some of the limitations and possibility of aesthetic capital? And I think that one is recognizing that there were these kind of multiple sides of the pageant. So on the one hand, they're presented as this is a platform for little girls to make their dream come true, and it's kind of presented as kind of open. Anyone can audition. You just have to buy the form. So you have to have the money to buy the form, as folks talked about and the other panelists talked about. But it's presented as this very open platform that you can be able to realize these dreams and aspirations that you have, not only for yourself, but for your community. But there are all of these kind of roadblocks. You know, first you have to have the money, you have to have people, you know, these are, you know, young who are oftentimes either college students or recent college graduates, or, you know, they haven't really launched their own careers fully. They're kind of on the early, so they don't have access to a lot of money. So they have to depend on either friends, family, or as was brought up, these sponsors that kind of help them get the money to be able to even, you know, participate and get all the gear that they need. So recognizing that it's not an equal playing field, even though it's presented as such, was one contradiction that it's important to realize. And then in terms of how it's passed on to others, I think that on the one hand, aesthetic capital is not just about like physical appearance, but it's also about all of these other forms of capital and other forms of other types of work that the contestants have to build. So they not only have to show that they're beautiful, but have to show that they're charitable, that they're good people, that they want to interact with people from all walks of life. And so it's not only about putting themselves in a positive life and doing the work for themselves and kind of getting some kind of being able to convert that into other forms of capital. For example, social capital in terms of their own networks and trying to meet people that are kind of big names in Nigeria. But they also have to, you know, for better or worse, to what degree they actually buy into the narrative. They have to show that they are doing, they're engaging in this work responsibly. Like they are responsible, they're morally upright, that they want to do this work to benefit not only themselves, but for others. So I think that kind of charity work and wanting to outreach to the Nigerian public is part of the ways in which they're trying to say, this is not only beneficial for me, but I'm also presenting myself as a positive role model, which is good for my community, is good for my country, and I can help people that might not have the access that I do have. But they ultimately want to trade that aesthetic capital for social capital and for financial capital. So the ultimate goal is to be able to use, you know, they would often say that this is a platform. It's just a starting point to like springboard me onto bigger and better things. So whether that's in the entertainment industry, many of them want to, you know, be in show business, starting their own brand, as was mentioned, and feeling like they need that kind of, it gives them some kind of legitimacy or some kind of access to these circles that they otherwise might not have access to make those leaps. And many of them, you know, did, in terms of starting their own companies, kind of going into professional work, roles of being doctors or engineers, etc. But then there are also folks that, you know, oftentimes to be able to leverage that aesthetic capital, they had to first place in the, you know, those that don't place, kind of, it's very easy to kind of sweep them aside, like you didn't place, so you're not really recognized, you know, and it's seen as you're seen as a bit of a write-off. So first you have to place in order to fully convert it. And then you also have to be willing to play some of the games that are kind of part of running in these social circles. And so there are possibilities, but there are also some, again, limitations to those in terms of how they're able to leverage that. One of the pageants that I studied, kind of their claim to fame is that one of their first contestants ended up being a politician. So there are ways in which getting access to, again, is also touted as being a possibility through participating in pageants. But again, recognizing some of the inequalities within that. In terms of the return to the state, why beauty pageants? So I think part of the reasons why beauty pageants are appealing in some ways is because of their association with young women that are seen as, one, less likely to be able to less likely to be able to be successful economically or kind of pursue their career path without having some kind of leg up. And so oftentimes the owners would frame their work as, you know, we're providing kind of these contestants with their own little entrepreneurial business and their own pursuit that will be helpful for them to be able to, for example, approach a politician or a government official to say that I'm doing something legitimate, so you should invest in me and believe in me. And so I think part of that is kind of relying on that image of beauty queens as being, respectful, as being morally upright, as being these showpieces of, again, promoting these more positive images of the state. And I do think that there are ways in which similar types of arguments can be made about, sporting, for example, sporting cultures. And one of the things that I found was that there was some kind of a soccer in particular, or what's called football in Nigeria. It was often like this silent rival where people would say, oh, there are all of these ways in which the state actually like fully recognizes football as being doing all of this work that we're also doing. But we're not getting like the same level of attention, money, and investment as soccer is, but they need to recognize that we're doing the exact same type of work. So the people in the industry were really invested in saying that this is there are all of these unrealized returns that the state hasn't fully tapped into, and talking about the ways in which they're again, that the state could further leverage the industry to their benefit, and that the state only takes recognition when there are things like an Agbani winning. That's when the state will step in and say, hey, look at what we did, even though they're reaping the benefits but not necessarily doing all the work to do that image management. Another question about Nigerian feminists. That is something I wish I would have been able to tackle more head on. I will share an anecdote that I thought was telling of some of the investments or not that Nigerian feminists might have in the industry. And so in the context of, I don't remember if I talked about the book or not, but in the context of the Miss World pageant, of hosting it in 2002, I talked to some folks that were part of this Nigerian feminist organization. And I was interested in to what degree they mounted a kind of response or were paying attention to the event. And one of the women I talked to told me that, we noticed that it was there. We have a critique that this is a capitalist private kind of venture, and they're only doing this, like those who are organizing this pageant were only doing it for corporate gains, and it wasn't beneficial to us as a society. But we're not going to put our resources into organizing against it because we have other concerns. We are trying to get water to these communities. We are trying to better the lives of orphans, etc. And so they just said, we recognize it's a critique, but we're not going to invest our resources in doing this. We're focused on immediate needs. So again, that's kind of one angle that I wish I had taken up more.
We have about 12 more minutes left, and so there's some audience questions to be able to incorporate some of them. Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you want to say anything else about the comments of the?
I'll just mention the comments about the personal sponsors, and I think that the way your read on it is very kind of this hidden narrative, and there was a version of the book where it was hidden, and I think that is kind of it's part of how it's talked about in the industry. Like it's reflective of how it's talked about in terms of it's kind of an open secret, and recognizing that on the one hand, talking about it openly was frowned upon, but it's something that everyone knew about. And so to kind of flip it on its head, I think the entry point would not have to be like the pageants themselves. It would have to be themselves, and using that as a starting point of thinking about, because it's not just connected to the pageant industry, it's connected to politics and corporations, and it's much more that. So I think that's a way to kind of tap into it, and it would be a different story.
Okay, great. So maybe we'll have time to go back to some of the questions that are made unanswered, but I thought it would be important to engage some of the audience questions. And so their questions actually connect quite closely questions posed already, but they sort of just take us to a different, takes it into a different like kind of angle. So the first question is from someone who wants to congratulate you for this important and innovative book. And they are intrigued by your concept of aesthetic capital, which is something that panelists talked about. And this audience member comments that it seems that aesthetic capital may diminish over time as the women age and as the women quote unquote outgrow the beauty pageants because of the narrow definition of youthful beauty. And so their specific question is, what are the implications of the seemingly transitory nature of aesthetic capital on other forms of capital for these women and for Nigeria's nation building project more broadly?
Thank you, that's a really good question.
Yeah, let me just start with that question.
Yeah, great. So I think the interpretation that this is very transitory, I think is spot on, because it's limited in terms of age. And so you kind of time out at a certain age period. You also cannot be married and you can't have children. So there are these particular restrictions in terms of like the mainstream pageants in Nigeria. And also it's often kind of frowned upon to do these repeatedly. And so there were some contestants that had done and participated in pageants more than once. And I found that they were sometimes kind of ridiculed for like not realizing that, okay, you do this one time, you try to do like as best as you can and move on to like use the people that you've met to do what you're supposed to do. And so it was kind of more okay if, let's say, you didn't place as high and then you returned, but again, it was seen as, you know, you participate in this, you try to get as much as you can and convert this into other forms of social and financial capital for yourself. So thinking about the ways in which, you know, it is a form of capital that is incredibly limited, like it's time limited, as was pointed out. And I think, you know, thinking about like actually your work about modeling as well, thinking that there are also these time limits. The thing about the payoff to the nation, though, is that even though on an individual level there are these time limits, there are these revolving door, like it's a revolving door. Every year there's going to be another pageant, and that's also part of the time constraint. So under your reign, you're supposed to take like as much of the spotlight as you can, because as soon as your reign is over, there's a next like crop of contestants that are putting their names out there and are doing this work of the work that they're expected to do. So even though it's limited at an individual level, they are relying on the fact that there's going to be another pageant, and as soon as the next season's underway, they're focused on the next, you know, being ready and willing the work that's expected of them. So I think in terms of the nation, it's relying on that kind of circle and cycle of contestants to be able to do that type of work.
Can I say something really quickly? It seems like the logic of beauty here really undermines the convertibility, because, especially as women age, because they do all of this work to become beauty queens and to be beautiful, but beauty, the logic of beauty is that it should be effortless and natural. And so they don't get credit for all of the discipline and labor that they invest in this, which limits the ability to convert it, because it's not seen as a skill, a set of skills acquired, you know, effortless and natural. And as they age, that, you know, they haven't built you know, like a recognizable toolkit then. Anyway, just sorry.
I know, it's so interesting. Yeah, we could go on and on about this. Like for me, a question I have, but you don't have to answer it, is like, I know in the Philippines, there's a lot of beauty contests and the people involved in it are gay men, you know? And so a lot of the capital goes to gay men, and it's like the gay men know how to walk the right way. So a lot of the trainers are gay men, the people who prepare them for questions and answers. And so they're the ones who get this long-term capital, because they stay in the industry, versus the women, like Kemi was saying, can come and go, right? And it's not always clear the capital that they build from this, like long-term. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. So Kemi had mentioned earlier and made a parallel with football. And so this question sort of links to that. And so the question is, they're curious about how heterosexuality features in the construction of national identity within the beauty pageant and in the nation more broadly. And they're thinking specifically of how 2002 was also the year that Nigeria hosted the African women's football tournament, and wonder what parallels might be drawn, if any, for these women as national representatives, like for women to represent the nation as athletes versus the nation representing, women representing the nation as, these beauty figures.
Great. Yeah, that's another very good question. So I think that there's definitely parallels in terms of thinking about femininity and nation building, and recognize it might be happening in different arenas, but what are some of the ways in which they're taken up and leveraged by different stakeholders. So one, I think that in terms of beauty pageants, this kind of thread of heteronormativity is expected and promoted. One, in terms of how sexual desirability is talked about for contestants, in terms of their expectations around marriage and the relationships that they form after pageants. So that's definitely in thread. I think in terms of sports and gender and beauty pageants, I think because of the associations between sports and masculinity, which kind of football and soccer, football and women didn't have like that same impact or leverage or intention as men in sports and soccer in particular had. And so thinking about, again, what are some of the leverage or some of the ways in which nation building gets built up through particular gender discourses. In the sporting arena, it's very centered around masculinity, and thinking about masculinity being the narrative and thread in which national building is being built up. Whereas thinking about how particular events and the ways in which they're framed and taken up in a way of presenting the nation, and recognizing that those are not gender neutral enterprises, that there are particular codes around femininity and masculinity that are being communicated in both of these arenas in terms of what's the spotlight being focused on. So that's how I would answer that particular question, but it's definitely more to think about as well.
So we're rounding out the hour here, but we have 3 more minutes to answer this last question, and then we'll wrap up. So this last question is from someone who's congratulating you again. And they want to know about the incorporation of plus-sized women, and how they're curious about how beauty pageants in the world are expanding the way that they measure beauty. And there has been an inclusion of plus-sized women in these contests. And they want to know, so this is their 2 questions. Do you think it's political move or an attempt diversity and inclusion? So I guess diversity and inclusion, equity, diversity, inclusion, is that trope entering beauty contests? And a second portion to that question is this a pressure of is this a successful feminist intervention?
Yeah, another really great question. So in terms of plus size women in the specific pageants that I studied, they were not welcomed, I guess I should say, to be succinct. And so they would oftentimes say, especially for the Queen Nigeria one, they would, we're open to anyone. It's not just about body size and kind of your physical, like how you look, but it's deeper than that. But in reality, I didn't find, when I actually compared in the years that I did the ethnography, when I compared the body, like the body measurements of both, they were very similar. So including plus size women was not part of the specific pageants I studied. However, I forgot what African country, but I remember reading a news article about a specific country in Africa advertising like plus size women through a particular pageant as a way of marketing their country. And so I'm like, wait, if this is not an example of using beauty in nation building, I don't know what is. But there are ways in which there is definitely a narrative around, you know, what African beauty is in terms of body size is more curvaceous. This gives us a leg up in terms of other countries around the world. Why not present this beauty, this form of beauty, as a way of showing what makes us unique around the world? So that's definitely a narrative. And as I said, there was a specific country, which I forgot which one, that was using that as a way of showing why their country was special. In terms of feminism and kind of a feminist, how does this connect to questions of,
like, you know, feminist, but I guess, you know, within Nigeria, it didn't really succeed, right? The inclusion of plus size women, but the question was really how the inclusion of over, you know, plus size women, are they, is this a feminist intervention?
Yeah, I mean, I think any time where you're trying to the norm in some ways, or calling attention to norms around different standards, whether it be beauty, etc., it's a feminist issue, right? And so it's a way of us not only recognizing that what are these norms that tend to be mainstream, that are circulating in these particular industries or these particular circles, but what are some ways in which we can trouble that norm and call attention to questions of inequality around, you know, body and beauty. So that's definitely, I think, a feminist concern. And I think part of my own intervention is trying to like nuance that discussion and not thinking about it as so kind of black and white.
Okay, so this should wrap. Thank you so much to the audience for joining us, and also to the panelists for your excellent comments. And do please buy the book. There's a picture of the cover, but here it is. So we will end now. So thank you very much.
Yeah, congratulations, Kemi.
Thank you, everyone.
It was a great discussion, everybody. It was great to be on the panel with you.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you. Thank you, Kemi.
Yeah,
bye, everybody.
Well done.
Bye.